I was still breathing, but my son had already brought a notary into the ICU. My daughter-in-law placed a pen in my hand while I was hooked to IVs, and my daughter whispered, "Just sign it, Mum. It'll ease your mind." I said nothing. I just stared at my three children and saw three strangers. I once believed if I died right then, everything would pass to them. But a month earlier, I had done something no one knew, and that day, none of them were smiling anymore. They never imagined the frail old mother they dismissed could do that. I stood at the upstairs window of my house in Key Largo, watching the evening light slip quietly over the water. The same soft pink and gold I'd watched for over 2 decades, just beyond the retreat center I built from scratch. Braddock Retreats. A place where women like me, women who had lost someone, came to remember who they were. I had walked hundreds of grieving women through their first holiday without a husband, their first birthday alone, their first quiet breakfast, in a world that no longer looked the same. But that evening, something in the light felt different. Maybe it was just me. 69 and slower on my feet. Or maybe it was the way my breath caught a little harder that week, how my chest felt tighter even when I was sitting still. I had been ignoring the signs for months, pushing through the weight in my ribs and the fatigue that clung like wet fabric. There was always something to finish, always someone to guide. Until the guiding stopped and the silence sat too long. On my desk, I had an email draft. It had been sitting there for 3 weeks. Subject line, Widow's Wings. No recipient yet. Just a blank field waiting for courage. The body of the message had only one line. I am ready to do something that has nothing to do with grief. I didn't know exactly what that meant when I typed it. I only knew that Braddock Retreats could not follow me into the years ahead. At least, not in the same way. That morning, I had spoken with Belinda, our director of care, who had also become my friend. She was 58, sharp, thoughtful, and had survived her own kind of loss that left her with an empathy I rarely saw in anyone else. She was the only one who noticed how often I was getting winded during check-ins, or how I gripped the stair rail a little tighter every week. That day, she had said something simple. "Evelyn, I think it's time for you to rest." Later that night, alone in the office, I pulled out a small folder I kept in the drawer under my printer. Inside were the first legal documents for a non-profit. Widow's Wings. Not just a retreat, not even a company anymore. Something different. A foundation, a legacy, a quiet pivot. I had transferred the ownership of Braddock Retreats into it 3 weeks earlier. Not a single share was in my name now. I hadn't told my children. Not Heather, not Malcolm, not Rachel. I told myself I would eventually, when the time felt right. But the truth was, I didn't trust the timing. I didn't trust what they might do if they knew. I know some of you listening have done the same. Held on to something alone because deep down, you knew that if you spoke it out loud, it would be taken from you. I closed the laptop. Outside, the light was gone. All that remained was the reflection of my face in the glass. I barely recognized her, but I nodded at her anyway. She had done something brave. I opened my eyes to the sharp scent of antiseptic and the steady hum of machines. The light above me was muted, sterile, and unfamiliar. My throat felt raw. Something was taped to my nose. Tubes ran down both arms. I could hear the faint rhythm of a heart monitor nearby, and beneath it, voices. Familiar voices. I couldn't move my head, but I could listen. One voice belonged to Heather, my oldest. I recognized her polished tone right away, the kind she used when she wanted something to go smoothly. Then came Rachel, quiet but firm, like she had rehearsed whatever she was about to say. And Malcolm, His voice was closest. He sounded impatient, pacing. I couldn't piece together how I got there, only that I was no longer in my home. My chest ached. I must have collapsed, or fainted, or something worse. But whatever happened to me had already happened. Now they were here, and they weren't whispering about my health. They were talking business. She still owns the paperwork. That was Malcolm. If we don't move now, it'll all be lost. Heather replied, "She isn't in any state to argue. We just need a signature." Rachel added, "Maybe she'd want to get it out of the way, for peace of mind." Then silence, a pause that felt too deliberate. A chair scraped. Footsteps. I heard the rustle of a folder opening, the flick of a pen cap. I didn't need to see it to know what it was. Legal documents. Maybe the company. Maybe the house. I couldn't tell which. I tried to lift my hand, but it barely twitched. I felt pressure on my left hand. Someone lifting it. Someone guiding something into my fingers. Just hold it for her. That was Heather again. She didn't sound cruel. Just detached. Like this was a matter of paperwork. Not a life. Not a mother. The pen was in my palm. My hand was limp. I could barely breathe, let alone sign. Then I felt Rachel near my ear. Soft. Almost kind. "Just a signature, Mum. You won't have to think about any of it again." My eyes were open, but none of them seemed to notice, or they assumed I couldn't see. I watched them blur into silhouettes. 3 children, 3 strangers, standing at the edge of my bed with a notary I didn't recognize. A stranger standing beside my son, waiting. I didn't sign. My fingers stayed loose around the pen. Heather gently pushed again, but I let it fall. It rolled down to the blanket. Rachel picked it up. Nobody said a word for a long moment. Then Malcolm let out a breath, like he was already exhausted by me. He muttered something I couldn't quite hear and walked out. The other 2 followed. The man in the suit left last. I closed my eyes again. Not because I was tired, but because the room felt colder than before. Not physically, just hollow. They had come to the hospital, not with flowers or comfort, but with papers and a pen. I had given them everything once. When they were too small to feed themselves, when they cried through the night and clung to my shirt. And now they had come to collect one more thing, and I hadn't even left yet. By the 3rd morning in the ICU, I had recovered enough strength to sit up without help. The tubes had come out, and the oxygen was no longer clipped to my nose. I could swallow again without pain. The nurses checked my vitals every 4 hours, and I did my best to stay alert. I had no intention of falling back into sleep, not while I still didn't know what my children had tried to make me sign. Belinda arrived that afternoon. She walked in quietly, with a small paper bag from the cafe downstairs, and her reading glasses perched on her head like always. When she saw me sitting up, her hand flew to her chest. "Thank God," she said. I was starting to worry. She sat down beside the bed and handed me the coffee. I took it with shaky fingers. "They came," I said. She nodded. I figured. They brought documents, a notary. She didn't ask for details. She didn't have to. Her eyes darkened, and she leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "Malcolm called the office," she said, "told the receptionist that since I was unwell, he'd be taking over leadership duties at the retreat." My fingers tightened around the paper cup. "He said I had given verbal consent last month," Belinda added, "that he was just waiting on signatures." I looked out the window. The view from the ICU was just the top of the parking structure and a stretch of grey sky. No water, no trees, nothing soft. I had always known Malcolm was ambitious. I just never believed he would come for what I built while I was unconscious. Heather would follow his lead. Rachel would stay silent. Belinda watched me for a long moment. "You don't have to fight this alone, Evelyn." I didn't answer, but my mind was already turning. That night, I asked the nurse for my bag. Inside was my phone, my reading glasses, and a folded sheet of paper with the password to my private email. I logged in, ignoring the dozens of unread messages. I opened the Widow's Wings folder and reread the documents. The retreat's transfer was complete. It belonged entirely to the non-profit. I had signed it over 3 weeks earlier in the presence of 2 witnesses and my attorney. It was no longer mine. But more importantly, it was no longer theirs. I opened a new note on my phone and began to type. June 4th, ICU. Malcolm brought a notary. Tried to force signature while I was sedated, Heather present. Rachel assisted, no prior discussion, no consent given. I saved the file and backed it up to the cloud. Then I emailed it to Belinda with no subject line. The next morning, I asked the nurse to bring me a cup of tea and told her I wanted to begin walking again. She smiled and said she'd call physical therapy. One step, then another. I wasn't steady, but I was clear. My children thought they had found their moment, that I was too weak, too unaware to resist. What they didn't realize was that I had already let go, not of myself, but of the thing they wanted most. I no longer held the reins, and that made me free in a way I had never been before. The following Tuesday, I was discharged from the hospital with a prescription for a heart monitor and a warning about overexertion. The doctor said I had avoided a full cardiac event by just a thread. He called it a scare. I called it something else, a shift. Not just in my body, but in how I saw things. Belinda picked me up. She brought a soft cardigan I used to keep in my office and a tote bag with small containers of soup, crackers, and herbal tea. The kind of care that didn't ask for anything back. We didn't talk much on the way home. I wasn't ready, not because I was afraid of what had happened, but because the house felt different now. The silence inside it was heavier than usual, like it knew. The first thing I did when I got home was walk to the safe in the guest bedroom closet. I opened it slowly, even though I already knew what I'd find. Everything was still there. The original trust transfer, the legal handoff of Braddock Retreats to Widow's Wings. The letters from the board acknowledging the transition. Each page had my signature and dates clearly marked. I took photos of every document and uploaded them to a private cloud folder. Then I put the originals in a fireproof lockbox and placed it inside a new safe I had installed in my bedroom wall months ago, one that only I and my attorney knew about. By Wednesday, Heather texted, "Hope you're resting. Let me know when we can come by." Malcolm followed with a message that read only, "Let's talk this weekend." Rachel didn't say anything, but I could feel her hovering, always the quiet one, but never fully out of the loop. I didn't respond. Thursday, I opened my email and saw something from the retreat's legal counsel. Apparently, Malcolm had attempted to schedule a meeting with them, using my name. He claimed he had authority to review and approve any upcoming partnerships on my behalf. But he didn't. That authority no longer belonged to me, and I certainly hadn't delegated it to him. I forwarded the email to Belinda and attached a copy of the transfer certificate. I added a brief note. "Please make sure staff are aware of the structure. No permissions come from my children. All queries go through the board." That night, I sat in the kitchen, sipping the broth Belinda had made. I looked out the back window, the same window where I used to watch Malcolm play catch with his son on Sundays. The same patio where Heather once brought over brunch for my birthday and arranged it like a magazine spread. The same backyard where Rachel planted tomatoes one spring and forgot to water them, then cried when they withered. It hadn't always been like this. But then again, it hadn't changed overnight either. I pulled out my journal, Not the digital one this time, a real notebook. I wrote everything I remembered from the hospital, every word, every glance, every moment when their intent had been clear. I dated the page. I signed it. Then I flipped to a clean sheet and began a new list. Things to prepare. Call the lawyer, lock down retreat communication, alert board of potential impersonation, install cameras on property, update medical directive, remove emergency contacts, change power of attorney. It felt clinical, methodical, but necessary. The next morning, I mailed a sealed envelope to my lawyer marked "For release only upon Evelyn's incapacitation." Inside it was the complete log of everything that had happened, along with a note that read, "If they come back, this is what they came for." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet, steady, like someone who finally knew what it meant to not be afraid. I had survived the hospital. Now I would survive the aftermath, on my terms. By the time Sunday rolled around, I knew they would come. They didn't confirm a time, but that was typical. Malcolm never believed he needed permission to show up at my house, and Heather had learned that same entitlement over the years. Rachel was quieter, but her silence had never meant absence. It meant calculation. I spent the morning as if it were any other. Boiled water for tea. Turned the porch lights off. Checked the mailbox. I didn't want to look like I was waiting. I wanted calm. My pulse stayed steady, and I kept the front curtains open. They needed to see I wasn't hiding. The black SUV pulled into the driveway just after noon. Malcolm stepped out first, buttoning his jacket like he was walking into a business deal. Heather followed in a tailored blouse and sunglasses, even though the sun wasn't out. Rachel got out last. She wore sneakers and held a reusable water bottle. Casual, thoughtful, as if that made a difference now. I opened the door before they could knock. They walked in without a greeting. I didn't offer one. Malcolm stood in the center of the living room and looked around like he was taking inventory. "We need to talk," he said. His voice carried weight, like he thought it would press me into compliance. I sat down in my usual chair by the window. They remained standing. That didn't bother me. Let them feel the imbalance. Heather pulled a folder from her handbag and placed it on the coffee table. She didn't say a word. Rachel glanced at it, then at me. Malcolm spoke again. "We've been thinking about your recovery, about what happens next. The family needs clarity, direction." I said nothing. He opened the folder. Inside were pages of legalese, drafts of a power of attorney agreement, authorization for medical decisions, a statement of shared interest in Braddock Retreats, a proposed joint account for managing retreat finances. It was all there, laid out like a generous offer, like I was being invited into my own life. Heather finally spoke. "Just sign the first two for now. It's temporary, just until things settle." Rachel added, "It's just for peace of mind. No pressure." I leaned forward and slowly closed the folder. "No." Malcolm stiffened. "You haven't even read—" "No," I repeated. "I won't be signing anything today, or any other day." Heather stepped back, blinking fast. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. Malcolm stared at me, face unreadable. His tone changed. "You're not thinking clearly. This isn't about control." I stood up. "I know exactly what this is about. And you're right. It's not about control. It's about trust. The kind that was broken the moment you brought a notary into a hospital room and tried to steal what I built." Nobody spoke. I walked to the door and opened it wide. "We're done here." Heather moved first, grabbing the folder. Rachel looked like she might cry, but didn't. Malcolm hesitated, his jaw tight. Then he walked past me, not meeting my eyes. The door closed behind them with a quiet click. I locked it. Then I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sat down. My hands trembled for the first time all day, but it wasn't from fear. It was from release, like something that had been coiled in me for years had finally unwound. I hadn't just refused to sign, I had chosen myself, my voice, my boundary, and now, whatever came next, I would face it standing, not asking, not waiting, not hoping for kindness that had already expired. The Monday after they left, I didn't move much. I kept the curtains drawn and the phone on silent. I let the clock tick through the daylight without checking it. I didn't clean. I didn't plan. I didn't speak. Sometimes stillness is not a void, it's recovery. By evening, I felt the shift again, not a dramatic one, but something steady. I opened the window over the kitchen sink, let the late spring air move through. I started to cook, not because I was hungry, but because I needed to smell something familiar. I made oatmeal with cinnamon and stewed apples. I sat at the table and ate slowly. That night I called Belinda. I told her what had happened. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask for more. When I finished, she just said one thing: "I'm proud of you." Tuesday morning, I took the envelope from my desk drawer, the one labelled for the board. Inside was a copy of the full retreat transition, a log of my recent interactions with my children, and a letter. In that letter, I made it clear that no family members were to be granted access to the property or involved in decision-making at any level. I wasn't asking for a favour. I was stating a boundary. I hand-delivered it to the board's temporary liaison office at the retreat that afternoon. I didn't linger. I walked the grounds once, slowly, as if saying goodbye to the version of myself who had once run staff meetings under the oak trees and planted daffodils along the pathways. Then I left. That evening, Malcolm called. I let it go to voicemail. Then Heather. Then Rachel. 3 messages in the span of an hour. "Mum, we need to talk again. It's not too late to fix this. Can we just meet and clear the air?" I listened once. Then I deleted them. Wednesday, I went back to my journal. This time I wrote about who I had been before all this. Not the mother, not the retreat director, but the girl who grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Ohio, with a father who read aloud from the newspaper and a mother who cut coupons on Sunday afternoons. The girl who didn't own much, but felt safe, felt chosen. By Friday, I had mailed 2 more letters, one to my estate attorney, updating the directives and reaffirming my trust terms, the other to a non-profit that supported caregivers of aging parents. I offered to sponsor 3 families for a full year of support services. Quietly, anonymously. I didn't need anyone to know. I just needed to remind myself that I still had power, not the loud kind, the rooted kind. That weekend, I cleared out the hallway closet, not out of anger or symbolic closure, just to make space. I boxed old towels and sheets for donation. I threw away worn shoes and expired pantry items. I rearranged the bookshelf and watered the plants. Some people rebuild with bricks and plans. I was rebuilding with breath. I no longer checked the driveway for visitors. I no longer kept a bag by the door in case someone tried to force their way in. I had already left the version of myself that would have opened that door. On the following Monday, a large white envelope arrived by certified mail. I saw the return address before I even broke the seal. It came from Malcolm's lawyer. I placed it on the kitchen table, sat down across from it, and let it rest there for over an hour. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak in the wood floors. Even the wind outside seemed to still. When I finally opened it, the papers inside were exactly what I expected. A formal petition for emergency guardianship. Malcolm had filed a motion in family court to obtain legal authority over my financial decisions. Attached were documents signed by Heather and Rachel, citing their concern over my recent erratic behavior and the supposed risk I posed to myself and my estate. They called it love, protection, intervention, but it wasn't. It was control wrapped in legal language. What caught me wasn't the content, it was the confidence. They truly believed I would fold, that I would panic, that their combined pressure would return me to the woman who once made space at every table for their excuses. But I didn't call them. I didn't shout or cry. I called my attorney instead. By noon, I was in her office. Her name was Anita Meeks. She had represented me through the transition of Braddock Retreats and had known me long enough to read between the lines. I handed her the entire folder, including copies of the hospital records, the notarized transfer documents, and my journal entry detailing the day they tried to coerce me in the ICU. Anita flipped through the documents slowly, making careful notes. When she finished, she looked up and said, "This is not just a defense. This is a pattern." She was right. We began building a timeline. Every text, every attempt to isolate me, every manipulation veiled as concern. I retrieved security camera footage from the retreat's main office, showing Malcolm attempting to gain access 2 weeks earlier. We filed a formal response by the end of the week. Saturday came, and the air felt heavier. Rain tapped against the windows all morning. I stayed in my robe and slippers, moving slowly, deliberately. Around noon, the doorbell rang. This time I let it ring. I watched through the peephole as Rachel stood there holding a tray of banana bread. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore the sweatshirt I once gave her on her first Mother's Day. She waited for a full minute before turning away. I didn't open the door. Later that night, I sat at the table and made another list. Not legal, not logistical, just a list of truths I had come to accept. I am not selfish for setting boundaries. I am not cruel for saying no. I am not broken because they left. I am not afraid of their silence, and I am not theirs to manage. I tucked that list into my journal. The following Monday, Anita called with an update. The judge had reviewed the initial petition and flagged it for further scrutiny. Our evidence had been received in full. There would be a formal hearing, but the tone had already shifted. What was once positioned as a rescue was now seen for what it was, a hostile takeover. I hung up the phone and stood by the window. The sky had cleared. The street was quiet. Nothing dramatic. Just stillness. Just breath. For the first time in weeks, I smiled without feeling guarded. Whatever came next, I would meet it with both feet planted. Not as a mother being corrected, not as a woman being questioned, but as Evelyn Braddock, whole, unbent, and finally, no longer waiting for permission. On the morning of the hearing, I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early. I wore my navy coat, the one I used to wear on donor visits and policy meetings, not out of pride, but to remind myself who I had once been in rooms like these. A woman with presence, a woman no one pitied. Anita met me on the steps. She looked calm, focused. She didn't offer platitudes, just nodded and walked beside me in silence. We entered the small courtroom. Malcolm sat at the opposite end with his lawyer. Heather and Rachel were there too, both in muted colours, eyes avoiding mine. I didn't expect them to look at me. I didn't need them to. The judge, a woman with salt and pepper hair and a precise tone, read the docket aloud. Then she asked for opening statements. Malcolm's lawyer spoke first, describing their version of me. Isolated, distraught, vulnerable. He used phrases like declining judgment and undue influence. I listened, not flinching, because I knew what came next. Anita stood, clear and composed, and began. She outlined my career, my accomplishments, my legal and medical autonomy. Then she introduced documentation, hospital records, voicemails, copies of the retreat transfer, surveillance footage showing Malcolm attempting to breach the facility's gate without authorization. She closed with a quote from one of my letters, the one I had written for the board. The court does not need to protect Mrs. Braddock from others. It needs to protect her from the illusion that family entitles anyone to her legacy. The judge took a long pause after the statements. Then she spoke directly, not to Anita or Malcolm, but to me. Mrs. Braddock, would you like to address the court? I stood slowly. My knees were tired but steady. I didn't read from notes. I simply said, I built my life with care. I gave my children more than I gave myself, but I will not spend my final years apologizing for needing peace. I am not confused. I am not unstable. I am awake, and I am not afraid of being alone. The judge nodded. She took another pause, then adjourned the hearing. No ruling that day. It would be mailed. Standard procedure. Outside the courthouse, clouds hung low. Anita and I walked slowly toward the car. When we reached it, she placed a hand gently on my arm. Regardless of the judge's letter, you just reclaimed yourself in that room. I went home that night and made soup, lentils and sweet potatoes, simple, warm, grounding. I lit the lavender candle Belinda had sent last winter. I didn't check the mailbox for 2 days. When the letter arrived, I opened it at the kitchen table. The court found no merit in the petition. The guardianship request was denied in full. Additionally, the judge cited potential financial manipulation on the part of the petitioners and referred the matter to a separate civil inquiry. I placed the letter beside my tea and stared at it for a long time, not from shock, but from something closer to release. Later that afternoon, I took a walk through my neighborhood, just 2 blocks. The air was soft. Children were drawing chalk suns on the sidewalk. A woman passed me with a golden retriever, and we exchanged small smiles. I didn't feel victorious. I felt intact. That night, I wrote in my journal. They tried to write the ending, but the story is still mine, and I am still writing. The letter rested beside a cup of chamomile tea that had already gone cold. I had read it twice that morning, not because I doubted its contents, but because something inside me needed to witness it more than once. It was official. Not only had the guardianship request been denied, but the court had opened a formal inquiry into the financial motives of Malcolm and the others. That was not just a victory, that was validation. Still, I didn't feel like celebrating. Not yet. I felt like cleaning. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through old drawers, papers, holiday cards, bits of ribbon and receipts. For years, I had saved everything. Every thank you note from Rachel, every sticky note from Heather, even the sloppy crayon drawings Malcolm made when he was still small and sweet. I placed a few in a box labeled for later, and the rest I quietly let go of. That evening, I prepared dinner for one. Roasted carrots, wild rice, a few slices of apple. I set the table the way I used to when company was coming. Not out of habit, but respect. Not for anyone else. For myself. Then I lit a small candle and opened my planner. The date was circled. In 2 weeks, the Braddock Retreat's legacy dinner was scheduled. It was supposed to be a celebration. The event Malcolm had once suggested be used to announce the handover of my estate, the one he thought would mark his arrival as successor. I hadn't cancelled it. I had simply changed the guest list. No family members, no heirs, no announcements. Instead, I invited every single person who had once been turned away, ignored, or dismissed when Braddock Retreats became a more exclusive venture. The teachers who used to bring at-risk students but stopped when fees increased. The retired nurses who had requested access for support groups. The local women's shelter coordinator who had emailed me 4 times before giving up. I wrote to each of them personally, and I told them the truth. This was no longer a family enterprise. This was a community commitment. In the days that followed, the RSVPs came in steadily. Some were short and polite, others brought tears to my eyes. A woman named Sheila wrote to say her sister had found peace during a workshop in our facility 10 years ago. Another woman, a grandmother raising her late daughter's children, said she never imagined stepping foot in a place so beautiful. That was when I knew I had chosen correctly. I also knew Malcolm would find out. And he did. 3 days before the event, he showed up unannounced. No lawyer, no Heather. Just him, standing at the edge of my driveway with both hands in his pockets. I didn't invite him in. He asked me calmly what I was doing, why I was throwing away the vision we had built together, why I was making this personal. I listened, then told him it was never personal. It was necessary, because I had spent too many years confusing love with loyalty, and I would not do it anymore. He stared at me, not angry, but hollow, like someone looking at a house he once lived in but no longer recognized. Before he left, he said one thing: "You won't have anything left for us when this is done." I looked him in the eye. That's exactly the point. Then I closed the door. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clean, whole. For the first time in months, I didn't brace for the phone to ring. I didn't flinch at footsteps outside my home. I simply stood in that quiet and let it hold me. And in that stillness, I smiled. Not because I had won, but because I had finally chosen myself. The night of the event arrived quietly, almost without warning. I had spent the morning in the kitchen, baking a simple lemon loaf and ironing my old navy dress. It wasn't new, it wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I wore it when Braddock Retreats first opened its gates to the public. It felt like the right choice to wear it now. At 5 o'clock, the sun was beginning to lower just past the hill. The garden lights blinked on, and the soft hum of chairs being set outside the glasshouse echoed across the lawn. I watched from the side entrance as the guests began to arrive. A woman with silver hair stepped out of her car, holding a young boy by the hand. A man in a postal uniform. A woman in a wheelchair, slowly wheeled forward by her teenage granddaughter. None of them were dressed up. None of them expected anything. Inside the glasshouse, long tables were covered in plain linen. On each plate, I had placed a handwritten note. "You belong here." That was all it said. I stayed by the entrance as everyone filtered in. I greeted them not like a founder, not like a benefactor, but like someone who was simply grateful to see them again. Then I stepped up to the microphone. Not because I had a speech, but because there was something that needed to be said aloud. I told them about the early days, about how this retreat was never meant to be gated or curated, about how I lost sight of what mattered along the way, and how I had chosen, fully and finally, to return it to its original purpose. I told them the land was now in the hands of a community trust, that the legal transfer was complete, that there would be no inheritance battles, no loopholes, no room for reversal. The retreat would belong to the people who needed it most. For a few seconds, no one clapped, no one cheered. And then, slowly, someone stood. Then another, then another. They didn't speak. They simply stood there with tears in their eyes and their hands at their sides, as if honoring something that had been taken from them and was now returned. I stepped back from the microphone. I didn't need to say anything more. That night, after everyone had gone and the candles had burned down, I walked through each room slowly. The library, the meditation room, the tiny nook by the staircase where I used to take my coffee before sunrise. Each space had memory carved into its corners, but none of them owned me anymore. I returned home just past midnight. My shoes were dusty, my hair loose at the edges, my voice raw from hours of quiet conversations, but I felt lighter than I had in years. On the kitchen counter was a small envelope. No name, just taped there, waiting. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper. Heather's handwriting. It said, "I didn't understand. I still don't. But I'm sorry. No demand. No request. No signature. Just a line. One small line that felt like someone letting go." I placed it gently in the drawer by the stove. Not because I forgave her yet, but because it no longer hurt to read it. That was the beginning of something new. Not a reconciliation, not a grand reunion, but a release. And in that release, I found peace that didn't come from victory or applause. It came from the choice to walk away from the story they tried to write for me, and to finally begin writing my own. About a week after the event, I received a letter in the mail. Real paper. No return address. It had been forwarded from the retreat office. I almost tossed it, assuming it was one of the usual complaints or inquiries. But something about the handwriting caught my eye. Slanted. Sharp. I opened it slowly. It was from Grant. He didn't start with Mum, just Evelyn. He wrote that he had driven past the retreat and seen people walking freely through the gates. He had parked and watched from across the street as a woman in a wheelchair was pushed down the gravel path by her daughter. Said he recognized her from a memory, one he hadn't realized he still carried. He said he felt something turn in his stomach. Not guilt, not regret, but something slower. A crack. Then, in two sentences that sat in the middle of the page, he admitted he had known about the trust transfer before the event. He had seen the signs, the filings, even overheard one of the community volunteers talking at a cafe near his office. But he hadn't believed I'd go through with it. He thought I would cave like I always had. His words, not mine. He ended the letter by saying he was not asking for anything, just that he understood now. Not why I did it, but that I had the right to. That part somehow meant more than an apology. I sat with the letter for a long time, not reading it, just holding it, letting the weight of those sentences settle into my chest. Later that day, I visited the bench by the garden, the same one where I used to wait while the first guests arrived years ago. I watched an elderly man tie a scarf around his wife's neck. She smiled without saying a word. There was no fanfare, no moment of recognition, just a life going on as it was always meant to. That night, I called Leslie. She answered quickly, her voice quieter than usual. I told her about the letter, told her I wasn't sure what it meant, or whether it meant anything at all. But I needed to say it out loud, to someone who had stood with me when things were darkest. She didn't speak for a while. Then she said she'd seen something shift in Heather too. A silence that wasn't cold, just cautious. And I said maybe that was enough. Sometimes all you get is space, not closure, not healing, just a little more room to breathe. The next morning I found myself at the community room again, not for business, not for work, just to sit, just to listen. A woman was telling her story about how she had left a marriage after 30 years, about how her children still didn't speak to her. But she was learning how to sit with that, to not let it define her. I didn't say anything, but I nodded when our eyes met. I think she understood. Sometimes the best stories aren't the loud ones. They're the ones that end quietly with no one watching, no one cheering. Just a single moment of stillness, a moment when you finally realize you are no longer waiting to be saved. You already are. The snow came early that year. It dusted the tops of the pines and rested lightly along the railing of my back porch. I stood there that morning with a mug of cinnamon tea, watching the light stretch slowly across the lake. The air was still, the kind of stillness you learn to appreciate only after you've lived through enough noise. Inside, the fire crackled faintly. I had no emails to answer, no board meetings to prepare for. Just a quiet Sunday, a life I had carved back from the chaos. The peace wasn't perfect. There were days when I still heard echoes from the past. But they didn't control the room anymore. They passed through like wind under a door. Felt, but not feared. I had an invitation sitting on my counter from a woman named Joyce. She had joined the retreat a few months ago, after her daughter placed her in a small facility and never came back. Joyce now taught pottery to the others. Real pottery. She never called it art therapy. She said it was just about shaping something with your hands that no one else could shape for you. I didn't attend the class, but I walked over that afternoon to watch through the window. They were laughing inside, not loud, but freely. I stayed outside, hands in my coat pocket, heart lighter than I remembered it being. Later, as I walked the path home, I passed a stone bench someone had etched with a quote. I paused to read it. No one can give you your voice back. You take it when you're ready. I had never seen it before, though the bench had always been there. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring, as if the stone was speaking directly to me. That night, I opened the locked drawer in my bedroom. Inside was the original letter from Grant, the one I had read and tucked away. I didn't tear it up. I didn't burn it. I read it again, this time slower, and then I folded it back and placed it inside a journal I had started weeks ago, not to write about them, but to write about me. The story wasn't over. It wasn't clean or resolved or wrapped in a ribbon, but it was mine again, and that was enough. If this story stayed with you even for a few minutes, thank you for listening. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from a perfect ending, but from telling the story out loud and letting it land where it needs to. If any part of Evelyn's journey felt familiar to you or reminded you of your own quiet strength, you're not alone. I'd love to hear what part stayed with you most. Your story matters too.